how do we give people a sense of that connection beyond themselves, to give them a felt sense of their connection to the natural world and to what they depend on?
So an important thing to understand about Homo sapiens that is different than all the other species, as far as we know, is you look at a horse and it's up and walking in 20 minutes. And it takes a human a year to walk. And you think about how we can be helpless for that long evolutionarily, right? Like, think about how many 20-minute segments go into a year, to think about how many multiples of helplessness that is. And even a gorilla or a chimpanzee can hold on to its mom's fur in the first few minutes, and we can't move our head for 3 months. We're like, okay, we are born super neotenous. We're fetal for a very long time. And the reason is because all the other animals evolved to fit an environmental niche. We are niche creators who went to the Arctic, who went out to the islands, who went to the desert, we were able to create niche adaptation everywhere, and then we made new niches like cities, right? And so we couldn't come with a hardwired program for how to be adaptive to a certain environment. We had to come not hardwired, learn what the environment was, because it used to be super valuable to throw spears. Now we don't throw spears that much, we text and do other things, so we have to actually be able to softwire. That means that we are radically more affected by our environment than all the other creatures are too. And not just in childhood, but even into adulthood and with neuroplasticity, we are continuously being affected by our environment. So when you think about that, our whole evolutionary history was in ecosystems that we depended upon, where the complexity of nature, the self-organizing dynamics of nature, was what our nervous system was taking in and getting an intuition for. And then we grow up not connected to any complex system nature, to a little bit of manicured nature, that's about it, and all man-made structures that are complicated, not complex. They're all fragile. You burn this house down, it doesn't repair itself. You burn a forest down, it does. You damage this camera, it doesn't repair itself. You cut me, I'll repair myself. So we don't even have an intuition for what nature is, or what complexity is, or what self-organization is, because we haven't spent any time around it. And we are that conditioned by what we're around. Now, younger generations that are growing up with almost their entire life from their earliest neuroplasticity is two-dimensional, right? And that it responds to them in a way that doesn't have physics. It has some other pre-programmed in physics, so there isn't even an intuition for how physics works. So all of that is a preface to say, reconditioning a felt sense of our connectedness with everything is not actually a trivial thing to do. It's a deep process. And there's a cognitive element that people can start with, which actually matters, which is, as soon as you just really think about it, and think about, who am I without plants? And who am I without pollinators? And you realize I don't exist. And you start to get that there is this kind of narcissism that we're stuck in almost all the time, thinking about me, I, and it's not even a good thought. It's not even a rational way to optimize my own life, let alone the fact that it creates depression. Just thinking cognitively about the interconnectivity of everything actually helps a lot. How to get a more embodied sense? Go spend time in nature, do psychedelics, do any kind of state practice that creates expanded states, see how you can have more intimate relationships with more people, all those things.
And when you sketch it out like that, it seems immense, the challenge. Are you hopeful or are you pessimistic?
I think that the shift that we are on the precipice of is not like the shift from the Dark Ages to the Enlightenment, or even the agricultural revolution. It's more like a shift from single cell to multicellular life. It's like a really deep fundamental shift in the level and type of complexity in the nature of reality that we're talking about. Evolution brought about rivalrous dynamics, but then it also brought about our prefrontal cortices, our capacity for abstraction, and our ability to do design and technology. Lions can't make themselves radically more capable as a predator in a very short period of time, faster than the gazelles can get away, right? If they could eat all the gazelles and then go extinct because they debased the substrate upon which they lived. And so as the great white's getting a little bit faster, the seals are also getting faster, right? The whole system is co-evolving, so there are no radical power asymmetries. We started modeling ourselves as an apex predator, but then developing tools that increased our ability to do that on an exponential curve when the environment wasn't increasing its capacity to deal with that on an exponential curve. That self-terminates. So that's evolution modified by technology. We need something that is neither of those things to be able to take the next step. And one way of talking about it is evolution is an unconscious process, right? It's an algorithmic process of which species survive and reproduce. And it's extremely slow and most things fail. What makes it through, though, has a profound degree of complexity. Design is a much faster process, but we always build things that optimize for some number of functions that we intended it to optimize for, but they affect more things than we intended to optimize, which usually is an externality. There's some harm where it wasn't intended. Evolution by design is something that is different than just technology design, where we're designing complicated systems, and it's different than complex design that is unconscious. There's a process by which we can think of it in mythopoetic terms and say the evolutionary process kept increasing orderly complexity until we got to the capacity for abstraction that could contemplate evolution itself and look at the principles of evolution, see what it's doing, and choose to consciously participate with and mediate evolution itself. And so then we get to we have the possibility of moving from being parts of the whole that are competing with each other, but moving to having power that makes that no longer possible, to actually being agents for the whole. Because we can't model ourselves as apex predators when we have the ability to extinct whole species, ruin whole biospheres, make new species. That's no longer an adequate model. The only thing in nature that has the kind of ubiquitous power that can make species and destroy species and change the geography is nature itself, but now consciously mediated through agents that have kind of woken up as that. So I think this next shift is us realizing that as technology that results from our abstraction, but focused on parts and not focused on how the whole thing fits together. As technology is kind of giving us the power of gods, we have to get the love and wisdom and understanding of gods, or we self-terminate with that power. That's a big task. I don't think that we can say that anything smaller than that could possibly be adequate.
You didn't say whether you think that we're likely to make it or not.
I think that if you were to, let's take the standard narrative on evolutionary history, and we say, okay, there was no life in the universe till started on Earth 3 billion years ago. So you've got billions of years, right? 10 plus billion years where there's no life. And a lot of shit happened, right? There was a lot of physics and chemistry and cosmology happening. You could say, based on that, it's probably that there's never going to be this thing called life, because forecasting from the current curve, it would seem like we've run all the combinatorics, right? And then life emerges. And then there's about 1 billion years where there's just single cells, and it seems like 1 billion years is a really long time to figure stuff out, and there's not going to be multi-cells. And it's actually when the single-cell creatures are at a phase shift of near self-induced extinction that leads to the environmental pressures that lead to multi-cells, and one narrative of how that happened. So it's kind of the nature of universe to do unprecedented stuff, right? That is kind of what evolution means, is that new epochs are unprecedented.
So you're saying we need a miracle, but we've had miracles in the past?
I'm saying we need an epoch shift that is not the continuation of the current curve, that is a discrete, nonlinear phase shift, and that if we think about it as just continuation of current curves, okay, these things are getting better with tech, let's just hope they keep getting better, it doesn't work. But if we say, what are the necessary and sufficient criteria of a civilization that doesn't self-terminate in the presence of the emerging power, we can actually identify what those criteria are, and they're actually things that we can do. Then that becomes the only MO that makes sense, is working to bring that about.
But then looking at the current political climate, looking at the current kind of the leaders that we have at the moment, do you have any hope that they are going to be equipped to bring this about?
Of course not. Because they are part of the system that is obsoleting itself.
Do you have a sense of how that shifts then if they can't do it?
I'll say things that everyone has probably heard when Bucky Fuller famously said, don't try to fight the existing system or fix it, just build a new one that obsoletes it, that it has the right characteristics. It's very much that. When we think about the kind of caterpillar to butterfly metamorphosis, inside the chrysalis, it's not a caterpillar or a butterfly, it's goo, right? And that goo phase, that liminal phase, the caterpillar is actually dying, right? Because the caterpillar doesn't just lose weight and grow wings. If you look at it, the caterpillar has a genetic code to go gather parts, right? To gather minerals and amino acids and sugars that are going to then be reassembled into a butterfly. If we were just looking at the caterpillar and we didn't know it was going to butterfly and we were looking at it's getting bigger and it's eating everything and it's not pollinating anything, we would predict that it eats itself into extinction. Except at a certain point, it gets rich enough blood chemistry that it triggers this movement into the chrysalis. It starts to dissolve. It gets reorganized at a amino acid level into something that now pollinates the plants that the caterpillar decimated across these vast spaces and helps the evolution of the whole system. The butterfly phase could not have been predicted from the caterpillar phase. So if we look at capitalism and the military-industrial complex and all those systems as gathering parts, right? Very much like the caterpillar was, net consumption, very much like a fetus is in utero. The fetus couldn't go past 40 weeks, 50, 60, it dies and the mom dies. But it also couldn't come out much earlier because it wasn't ready to make a phase shift. It comes out when it first can. It has finally evolved to the place that it can actually do breast milk rather than get food from the umbilical cord directly. But it also comes out when it has to. There's a fairly narrow window of transition. The same is true for an animal developing inside of an eggshell, right? There's a finite amount of resources, and when it runs out, it has to emerge, but that's also the first time that it can emerge, that its system can handle the transition. So we see in nature this kind of precedent that these discrete nonlinear phase shifts, because there's a curve of in utero, and then there's a shift, and then there's a curve outside, but that discrete phase shift of come through the birth canal is different than either the phase before or after. So when you're asking, like, are any of the caterpillars going to be able to do the pollination thing? Well, it's the wrong question, right? Like, the problem that we see is the caterpillars are eating everything. That's true. And that is to gather the resources that get assembled in for a fundamentally different set of reasons. It's, if we say, how do we maintain strategic competitive advantage? That's what the leaders are trying to do. The leader of a company is trying to maintain strategic competitive advantage against the other companies. A country is across other countries. But of course, the moment you have some source of asymmetric advantage and you deploy it, everybody sees it, reverse engineers it, makes modifications on it, and you just up the level of rivalry for the entire playing field. That itself is what is terminating the seeking of strategic competitive advantage, the rivalrous dynamics, because that is what actually self-terminates with this level of power. So it's how do we take all the technological capacity and start to use it for something that is not trying to have power over, but to have strength to not be deformed by other power and be able to be anti-rivalrous and etc.